Welcome to the Inside Out, Outside In podcast. This podcast is for and by colleges and universities and its surrounding and supporting communities. The content of the podcast is guided by the themes of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Given the high rates of infection and hospitalizations, as well as the large number of people who have passed on due to the coronavirus infection or the coronavirus, I thought it would be fitting to sort of hear the stories behind the funeral industry. And so today I have a good friend of mine, Rachel Gully, and Rachel is going to be talking to us about some of what we've been hearing in the news, but helping us to really understand the humanity behind the work she does as a funeral director. So, welcome, Rachel.
Well, hi, Christiana, and thank you for inviting me on your podcast show. I really am excited to be
Yes, I mean, we started our careers in the child welfare system,
here.
and we met over 30 years ago in New York City, child welfare. And we both retired from that field and went to two different fields. I went into social work education, and you went into the funeral industry. So, Rachel, can you share with the audience a little bit about yourself and specifically your professional background?
Sure. Well, I'm a retired professional from child welfare after about 35 years of service. As you said earlier, we worked together there. And I started out as a caseworker and I retired as a curricular program developer and workshop facilitator. I have a master's degree in public administration from New York University and a degree in mortuary science from the American Academy McAllister Institute. And I'm a licensed funeral director in Maryland for a funeral home called Howell and Jolly Memorial Chapel. And I am becoming licensed in South Carolina as a funeral director as well. I am presently an ordained minister, and I've had outreach activities within different churches within our community. And I actually consider funeral service a good fit because for me, it's an extension of my ministry work.
Right. So, what drew you to the work of mortuary science?
That's an interesting story. As a young person around the age of 10, one of my best friend named Gertrude died, and her death had a most profound and impactful um, action on me because I did not know anyone that close who had died, especially a young person. Gertrude died of a cancerous brain tumor, and as you might expect, her physical appearance became quite altered due to the suffering and the medication she was taking. And I was amazed at how much the mortician restored her physical appearance, including her coloring. So that impacted me and it resonated for me because that was a lasting memory that I had of her in that casket, looking like a doll baby. So as I grew older, I just felt a spiritual pull towards ministry work. So I became active in the local churches and I volunteered for hospice. So I knew there was a passion around helping take care of the sick or the infirm or the dying. And then I became involved with anybody in my family that was ill. I kind of was there helping them. So I realized that it was more than just a curiosity. For me, it became like a passion, something I really felt a connection with. So after my work in hospice for 2 years as a volunteer, I really thought the next step for me would be doing something with death and dying. And then I went to school and got my degree to become a funeral director.
Okay, thank you. So, what would you say? And I have to say, I have very little knowledge of that field or industry. Um, I, what would you say motivates you to do the work that you do?
For me, it would have to be the spirit of God who motivates me to do this work. Comforting others during one of the most worst experience in their lives is not an easy task, and I don't think this work is for everyone. I mean, you have to find out what really gives you some sort of sense of reward. And I find that this is a rewarding job for me, and I can't do it in my own strength. um, I have to rely on the presence of God and the Spirit of God. And it's a rewarding feeling to be able to help families through the healing process after an emotional loss. And I think it's worthwhile. It's a noble profession.
Somehow I didn't see many Black women in this field. Um, are you an anomaly?
Almost so, yes. There aren't that many blacks in the business of mortuary science, period. And there's a very, very small percentage of black females in the business of mortuary science. So, yes, it's not something that you see women gravitating to historically. It's been a male dominated profession. However, even the small increases that we see is impressive. Women are going to school, young women, middle aged women, they're going to school and they're finding some satisfaction in doing this kind of work. But yes, we are on the small percentage scale.
Right. And you also teach in I forgot the university, but you teach as part of the mortuary science certificate program or license program, right?
Yes, I graduated from American Academy McAllister Institute, and I now teach there. I teach Anatomy 1 and I teach Anatomy 2. And we are seeing more women coming to the school to get their license and qualify. So it's exciting. It's exciting to see women of all ethnic groups, first of all, coming to the field.
Right.
And yeah,
Do you have to go to college first, or is this like something, or can you just go straight from high school? Do you know?
yes, you can go straight from high school. As long as you have a GED, you can go straight from high school and get qualified.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for
Hmm.
that. What would you say are the joys and the challenges in your work?
Well, Chris, I would say the joy I experience is when I see the satisfaction on families' faces when they see their loved one looking good, and it's a good lasting memory that they have of that loved one. They look well. They don't look like they were sick. We have been able to be successful in restoring people's looks and their appearance, and that's a good feeling when a family say to me, "You made this so easy. I am so grateful to you. He looks so good. She looks at peace. I just love how the flowers look. I love the attention you paid. It's like you really made this an easy process for us." I love that. That is very rewarding and it brings me joy because we pay attention to the little things that's going to make a big impact on the family.
Yeah, I'm sure, particularly at this point, right, with the increase in deaths, we're in the middle of a pandemic, COVID-19,
Yeah.
and you're hearing stories more and more of people dying
Hmm.
as a result. Can you share some of the stories on the front line? Just to sort of give us a human, I mean, and just to sort of help take us through. At the beginning, I know we were hearing about a lot more people dying,
Hmm.
and we were hearing that people could not have regular funerals.
Right.
And fortunately for me, I didn't have an experience with someone directly, but
Right.
I did attend a funeral remotely, and I remember how odd that felt. And today, so if you could just sort of walk us through
Oh,
what it was
sure.
like at the beginning and what it's like now, 2 years later, in terms of funerals.
Sure. Well, most since I work for a black funeral home, Blacks are accustomed to having very large and long funerals. Um, so for us, we had to try to create as close as we could to a traditional funeral. And since at the beginning they had this restriction on mass gathering as to how many people actually can be in a space at the same time, we were told 10. So what we did was we would have everything set up like a traditional funeral would be, whether it's at the church or at our chapel, at the funeral home, and then we would allow 10 people after they got their temperature checked and sanitized. We will allow them to go in one at a time, but no more than 10. And they were able to view the person. We did not allow them to touch any surface at all. Um, Most of them, we had gloves if they were open to wearing gloves, but they couldn't touch anything. Had to have on a mask. So just those things alone was kind of odd for most people, and viewings could end up being like 7 hours long. That was not uncommon in the beginning for us to have viewings for 7 hours long because the funeral only had those 10 people. And it was challenging for families because families had to actually identify 10 people who would be allowed to actually sit in the funeral. So it was odd for them and it was odd for us, but also we made it available for them to have live streaming. So live streaming became very popular. As you said, you were a part of a remote funeral service. Well, the live streaming became very popular because people wanted to at least feel some sense of participation in that entire process. So families, even when we did the arrangement conference, we did some of them remotely, or if person needed to be in person to sign documents, we'd only have one or two people in the actual offices where we conducted our arrangement conference. But a lot of work got done and a lot of planning got done remotely via Zoom or just phone conferences. So that was somewhat challenging. The other challenging part is that prior to COVID, and again, some of these families we served when there was no COVID. So now someone died in their family either of COVID or unrelated to COVID. The way we engaged them was very different because we couldn't embrace them. We couldn't comfort them in the way we were accustomed to comforting them. There was really no touching involved. So, and we had to keep our social distancing as well. So that was a challenge. And we spent a lot of energy in making the funeral home or the church look like it was a traditional type of gathering for families.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it's quite a bit to navigate, and it happened so quickly, right? You basically had to pivot to the remote, the live streaming, and the social distancing restrictions that impacted your industry altogether. Wow.
Oh, yes. In the beginning, too, I have to say, we got a lot of pushbacks. And also in the beginning, when we first started, when the governor first announced we had to limit mass gathering, we had police officers circling around the funeral homes to make sure we didn't have excessive amount of people. They
Mm,
were actually policing to make sure we were adhering to the restriction of mass gathering, which
mm,
is why we extended the viewing so long because people would come view. They couldn't tally around, they had to leave. So
mm.
another set of cars can come in and let those people view, and then when they're done, they had to leave. Because
Wow.
yeah, it was a very unusual situation, and it was challenging for families to break down and cry, and we couldn't comfort them. So, and they had some of them comfort one another, and some of them just had to stay their distance because they were not accustomed to being around people that were in their family, but they were living in different places, so they weren't around each other. So they had
Right.
to still keep themselves safe, even
Right.
from each other.
So I'm also thinking you said some of these viewings are 7 hours. So it's almost like you have to do one funeral at a time, right?
Oh yes, yeah. In COVID environment, back in the beginning of it, we did one funeral at a time, and we also ended up doing. Although this is not necessarily just related to COVID, we've done funerals at night as well. We didn't do burials because we're not allowed to do burials at night, but we have done funerals that would start at 6 o'clock because that's what the family wanted it. Because if they were doing live streaming, whoever they wanted to be a part of that had to be available to be involved with the live streaming.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Right. Have you seen any changes in, I know um, what I heard, I should say, based on my research, is that there tend to be more cremation more due to COVID. Have you found that to be true?
I will say that response is going to be twofold.
Okay.
First, yes, I think there's been an increase because of COVID. However, that increase was already beginning to take place pre COVID because of the cost of traditional burial
Mm.
services. The average funeral is like about $8,000, and that does not include the actual earth plot that has to be purchased or the opening and closing of the grave that has to take place or the outer burial container. So the increase in cremation was already beginning to take place because of the cost of a traditional service. Now that COVID has actually impacted that even more because you do have more African American and Black people cremating at a much higher rate than probably would have happened had there not been a COVID.
Right, because we tend to believe more in going into the ground, right?
That is true. Our
Having the,
culture
yeah,
support going into the ground, and we've had people who want their loved one to go into the ground, but for a myriad of reasons, they choose cremation. A good example would be I just had worked with a family whose mother passed away of COVID. And they knew that they wanted to do a cremation because from what they said, she expressed a desire to be cremated. I'm not sure if that desire was anything because of COVID or if this is how she felt before COVID. So when they came and engaged with me in providing the service, they made it clear they're not going to do any kind of major funeral. They said, but we do want to have a viewing. So I said, okay, we can arrange that. When I guess they took a poll with the family members who would be willing to come to the funeral, and no one wanted to come out to be in part of the viewing or any
right,
kind of service. So they decided, well, let's just do a direct cremation. And the son chose to do a Zoom funeral from his home. He had the clergy there and just his immediate family and his sister come, and everyone else was on the Zoom. And they did their respectful memorial for their mother because her body was not there. So
right.
if a body is not present, it's called a memorial. If a body is present, then it's called a funeral. So they had a memorial for her. Interestingly, as I continued to talk with the daughter, she said, Rachel, we are very comfortable with our decision. She said, I live in Georgia, and there was a prominent individual in the community who passed away, and it was a whole lot of folks that came out to the funeral. And she said, subsequent to them going to this funeral, 30 people died of COVID.
Wow.
Yes, that was
Wow.
in the community that attended the funeral and they died. Now, I've had some experience with that, but not to that number.
Right.
I've done funerals where people came out and subsequently about 10 or 15 of them became hospitalized because they're exposed to COVID,
Hmm.
and a couple of them did die. But 30 was amazingly shocking to me that 30 people in that community died because they attended this funeral.
And this is recently.
Yes, this is recently. Yes. So
Wow.
they were very comfortable not doing anything that was going to, number one, jeopardize themselves, and number two, jeopardize the safety of others.
Right. Now, is there any belief in that it's preferential to, or it's preferred to cremate the body of someone who dies of COVID versus giving them a regular funeral and putting them in the ground? Do you know of?
In the beginning, when there was little information about COVID, that was what was recommended or suggested. And I know that in the city, when this first came on, they had these makeshift morgues that was on the streets in the inner city, Manhattan, Brooklyn, etc. And they did some cremation as the first preference of disposition. But since since then, there has not been the same push by the authorities or the health department to do any kind of cremation. People can do a earth barrier, and we have done embalming safely, and we are able to protect the person who's coming to say goodbye to their loved ones with the traditional type of funeral, because we do a lot of precaution, take a lot of precaution, and we do what's needed to preserve that body so nothing is going to be contagious to that body.
Okay. Wow. Actually, that really brings me to another question. I was thinking, a lot of people are out catching, in different industries, catching COVID and are getting sick and dying. How is the funeral industry in terms of people, you know, getting sick, getting hospitalized, or even themselves dying of COVID?
Well, we're not immune. We have to take precaution, very much so. I mean, there are several funeral homes that have people who have gotten COVID. Some of them have died. Some of them have obviously survived. And there's no rhyme or reason as to why one person dies of COVID with some underlying condition. Another person has similar underlying condition, yet they survive.
Right.
But yes, we have had um, quite a few people in our community of funeral industry die. There was an article written in the Times magazine, Times newspaper, by this particular person called Eduardo Medina. Apparently, he did some research on this, and what he says, and I'm a quote, is more than 130 Black morticians and funeral directors have died across the country since
Wow.
the start of the pandemic. Okay, and this is according to Harry P. Close, who is the president of the National Funeral Directors and Mortician Association. So we don't have a lot of blacks in the industry, period. According to Mr. Close, there's approximately 3,300 black licensed morticians and funeral directors. So yes, it takes a toll on us as well, because even though we take precautions, we may not have been exposed due to anyone that we met in a funeral or during a funeral, but we're in the world. We're doing shopping, we're visiting other people, visiting family, and most of us are taking precaution. However, sometimes people let their guards down, even though they know better. Sometimes they don't wear their masks. Sometimes they don't wash their hands as often as they should. So, to answer your question, we are part of that population that also have experienced deaths of our colleagues.
Yeah. Wow. I come from a country where there were like two funeral homes, right?
Mm.
Um, but in terms of African American or Black funerals industry, the funeral industry, based on what you just said, there isn't a large number. But I know that historically there has been a pretty sizable or a decent number of funeral homes because of need, right? They had to.
Oh yeah, and you have, if you want to go back very very far, you know, white funeral homes didn't want to take care of deceased black bodies.
Mm,
So, there's always been qualified black people in the industry. Whether they had their official papers or not, they were taking care of each other when death did occur. So, I
right.
mean, when you think in terms of there is, let's say, Prince Gear. He was an expert embalmer during the Civil War, and he was the first historically recorded African American to hold that position. And the first funeral home was A.D. Price Funeral Home in Richmond, Virginia. And then we had another one that early on, E.F. Boyd Funeral Home in Cleveland, Ohio, which was founded in 1905. So black churches began taking care of each other by creating a burial society around the 1900s. They
Mhm,
collected money from the church members so they could pay for families' funerals, coffins, and graves. And in fact, that mindset really was like the forerunner for what people do today, which is pre-need planning. They plan their funerals in advance and start saving money for that funeral so it becomes less and less of a burden to their families when they do die.
mm, mhm. Very important, right?
It's something that people don't want to think about, but it's very important because it's unavoidable, and we have seen people die unprepared. And whether that's in the COVID climate or pre-COVID climate, when someone dies unprepared, they leave a burden to whoever's left behind, whoever's the next of kin, to figure out how do I respectfully dispose of this individual that I love, where I can afford it. So it's a lot to consider, but it's something that you can never plan too early for your funeral.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think people, it's like getting a will, right? People think if they start to plan for these
Hmm.
things, their funerals or plan or get a will, then that means that they are somehow engaging with death, right? On some level.
I think that's well put, Chris. Yes, I think it's psychological, that people don't take it as seriously as they should, or even take on the responsibility. I mean, it's really an empowering position to be in. You, as an individual, you're deciding how you want your final arrangement to go, as opposed to putting that in someone else's hands. When I do pre-needs with families,
What's
and
it called? Pre-need?
yeah, pre-need, it's a pre-need arrangement because the person is picking out all of the merchandises that they think they want for their funeral. So, and
Oh,
they pay for it. They pick out their casket, pick out what color they want, pick out what type of program they want, pick out where they want to be buried. All of that is done when you're doing a pre-need prior. So the family member who's left behind, the only thing they have to do is meet with that director and finalize everything.
yeah. I remember when my father died 2 years ago, I was in New York at the time, and I had to you know, I had to make decisions on the phone, and I'm like, what? This is
Yeah.
crazy, crazy. It's a big burden that people don't often think about, right?
Yeah, it's a huge burden. And here's the other thing, Chris. When a person does a pre-need arrangement, they're really giving their family a gift. And I consider that gift to be the gift of being able to grieve. Because when a person dies, the next of kin, they're overwhelmed by the death. First of all, they're in shock. They don't know which direction to go. And then now, if they're compounded with the finances that has to go with that, they can't really start to grieve until all of that is behind them. And sometimes even then, it becomes complicated because if they didn't have the money and they had to go do a GoFundMe account, or they had to dig into their own savings, which might not have been a large savings, but they had to dig into that, that can all impact your grieving because you're in business mode
Mm-hmm.
at this point. And then it's not until Even under the best of circumstances, grieving can be hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's compounded when there's no money to bury this person. There's no plot to put the person in. We don't have money, so the family has to gather up the money. All of those things can impact how successfully a person can grieve and move on.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. In terms of grieving, though, have you seen any difference pre to current situation pre-COVID in terms of people grieving? I mean, I'm imagining a lot of people are losing family members or friends all at once, right?
Yes. Um, when a person dies in our funeral and come to our funeral home, we still reach out to them afterwards. It's not like they just come and go away. We try to stay connected. We try to offer emotional support, so we connect with them. By email or by phone or by a card in the mail to let them know we're thinking about them. And typically, what I have observed is that when a person dies of COVID, it's so sudden because most of the families say, but this was not something that had to happen. This could have been avoided, or he or she was only sick for 2, 3 days. The person who we are currently working with is a young man who passed away, and he's a big, strapping, healthy looking individual in his life. When you see pictures of him, was not ill very long. Somehow or another, got exposed to COVID. Within 5 days, he was gone.
Wow.
That is shocking because this person was walking around healthy. All
Right.
of a sudden, gets a couple of symptoms, and then he's no longer here.
Right.
Same thing happened with a friend of mine who is a minister, was a minister. She helped me when my sister was transitioning in the hospital. She would come over and comfort me at the hospital and just be a big support. And she ended up getting COVID, and within less than 10 days, everything was over for her.
Mm.
And the other thing with the COVID situation is that if you get it, it depends on your living arrangement. Your family members may not feel comfortable being there. So in her case, she ended up being alone because of the quarantine situation. So she wasn't, she didn't have people around her to see how progressively weak she was becoming
Right.
and how
Right.
dehydrated she had become. So
Right.
by the time I think they realized it, they took her to the hospital, but she died within an hour.
Right.
So yeah,
Wow.
it's an unknown territory for, I think, all of us, the professional, the health department, the medical field. Certainly for us on this end of the medical field is new, and for families. So I think when it comes to grieving, I think families are trying to figure out how to grieve. How do they grieve something that happened so suddenly and something that could be somewhat potentially avoidable? I
Mm.
don't know if these individuals have all taken their shots, although I have had family where the person did take both vaccination and the booster, got exposed and died anyway.
Wow.
I've got several cases of situations where I bury people and they said, well, they had the shots, they took the booster.
Right.
Why is this happening? So I just think there's a lot of unknown about this.
Hmm. Wow. Well, thank you for talking about that because as a social worker, the grieving process is so important for us to pause and to take a good look at, right?
I think
Um, yeah. And so then the other thing that also concerns me because it appears as if more and more people are dying of COVID. So we're going to
mhm.
need more and more people in your position in the funeral industry or business to take care of our dead. And it sounds like there's going to be a shortage to some degree.
Well, we certainly, as I said, we're not immune. We take precaution, and
Mhm.
thank God, I don't know of any person personally that have died from it. I know several of my colleagues have been infected, um, but they survived.
Right.
So, and
Yeah.
that,
Yeah. I was wondering though, I'm wondering if, how do we get new people, young people, interested in this field, particularly young Black men and women,
hmm
more interested in this field? Because I don't think any of them are thinking mortuary science, or like I
no,
don't think that's on the menu.
yeah. Well, I would have to concur. I would have to really agree with you and concur. Um, when people, let's say, when young folks tend to gravitate to this business, is usually because there's a family connection. They grew up in it, or they knew someone very close to in the community. They got connected to a funeral home, and they kind of got intrigued by that and were curious. But just someone switching fields just arbitrarily after going X amount of years to become qualified to do something, and then they switch gear. That's not often, but we are seeing younger people coming into the field. In my class, I have I think maybe about 10 young people. When I say young, I mean like 25 and under.
Okay.
But there's a lot of people over 25, somewhere between 25 and 65, that's in the mortuary science trying to get qualified. So it's a mixture. But to answer your question, how do we get people of color interested while they're young in the mortuary science work? I think that there needs to be a lot of creativity around that, and creative ideas and enticement, and maybe announcements, or recruiting people. I don't know. It's not a fascinating field for many people. And here's the other thing too: a lot of families who are in the business, interestingly enough, their children don't want to be in the business, But a smart business owner who has got children, and the child or children may not be interested in the mortician business, they need to still get licensed, because if an owner owns a business, a funeral business, and they pass away and their children are not licensed, then the children they can't own the business. They can inherit the business, but they can't own it. So yes, I just think it requires something the community, and it may need to start with funeral homes. Maybe Black funeral homes maybe need to take up that mission to educate, recruit, and reach out to
Right.
younger Blacks to let them
Right.
know the need for their work.
High school, college. I don't remember
Yes.
any job fair with, what are some of the jobs that are available in this field?
Oh, okay. Well, besides besides the obvious, a mortician or a funeral director, we have need for people to be a transporter. People can transport bodies from pickup, which is the site of death, to the funeral home, or to the ME's office. So transportation is one. Dressing and casting the individual, cosmetizing an individual. The only thing is, though, that most funeral homes, their funeral directors and their morticians do all of those things, you know.
Right.
So a person, I mean, as far as making a career, you probably would not, as a young person, be able to make a career transporting bodies, because that's one of many activities that the mortician or the funeral director could do, and they may hire you to do that, but that wouldn't be full-time work.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right. But it could be part-time job, part-time
It could
working
be a part-time job.
while you're in high school or while
Yeah,
you're in college, and you can start out that way and begin
yeah,
to learn from the inside out about
yeah.
the other roles, right?
Absolutely. And we have some people that are now working, that's been working for the funeral home, and that's how they started. The people who are presently working with the funeral home that I'm working for, who are doing those kinds of things, they've been there 20 something years or longer.
Right.
and they
right,
started what they but they did not go get qualified. That's the other dilemma. We have a lot of people who, and this is across the board, Hispanic, Asian, white, doesn't matter the ethnicity. We have a lot of people who are interested in mortuary work when they're young. They don't, for whatever reason, pursue getting qualified. So even though they may be masters when it comes to dressing their body, cosmetizing their body, and even may have learned how to embalm that body, but if they don't go to school and get qualified, they are not able to do that legally as a career. They just can't. And we find that to be somewhat commonplace. Even in the school where I'm working at, I have students who say to me, I've been working in the funeral business for 3, 4 years, and I know how to embalm, and they let me help with the embalming, and they let me do this or do that, but they're not passing the courses. They're not
right,
able to academically do the work. Now they
right,
can do the work hands on
right,
because it's once you've seen it, you've done it a couple of times, they can do that and they can be very proficient at it.
right.
But if they can't pass the school program and if they can't pass the nationals and the jurisprudence, then they can't become qualified and licensed. And I
So it's
think,
right. So part of it is the academic
mhm.
rigors of getting, is it a degree or some kind of certification?
No, it's an actual degree. It's a
Okay,
degree. And
okay,
here's the thing: most of the students, and it's not just at the university where I work. This is various universities. We are all experiencing the same thing, where students are amazed at the level of work that is required. I'm not sure what their thoughts were, but now that they're in the school, they're like, I had no idea this was going to be so hard. I had no idea I would have to spend so much time with this. And I kind of understand it a little bit because, to be perfectly honest, when I look back at my decision, I was 59 when I decided to go change careers. And I do believe if someone had told me it was going to be as hard as it is, I may have not gone. So I was glad that I had to learn it was that hard because once I got into it, I wasn't going to quit. I wasn't going to
right,
drop out. I just had to bite the bullet and give it my best, and just go through it. But I'm glad I did stick out
right.
with it.
And the other side of that is the cost, right?
It's very expensive. I think my degree cost me close to 30,000.
Okay. And how long does it take to get the degree?
It's going to vary. They give you 4 years. All the schools give you 4 years. I took 3 because I went to school every semester. I was in in the class doing some 2 or 3 courses. I took no
Okay,
time off. It was 3 years straight.
right. Okay, okay. That's great. Well, thank you for sharing that. As we wind down towards the end of our time together, I always ask this question of all my guests. If you
Mm.
have only one message to share with the world, what would it be?
Oh gosh, okay. I guess if I had one message, being that I am in the field that I'm in and I'm seeing death and dying all the time, and having worked in hospice, and just knowing what I know about the human experience, this journey, I would have to say that my message would really come from one of my favorite scriptures in the Bible, Isaiah 55, um, verses 6 and 7, which says it's an invitation actually to an abundant life. And isn't that what we all want? Don't we want an abundant life? Don't we want safety? Don't we want refuge? Don't we want a peace of mind? Don't we want to know that we are well, that this life ends out well for us? So I guess my parting message would be something like the scripture reads: Seek the Lord while he may be found, call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, and He will have mercy on him. And I think the world needs just that. The world needs divine intervention. The world needs mercy. The world needs a savior, a deliverance. You know,
Well, thank
that's
you. Thank you so very much for joining us and sharing your knowledge and experience in the field of funeral services, because we often don't have any knowledge except
mm-hmm.
when we are bound to be there because of a family or friend. um, but
No.
yeah, this is so important. We need the voice of particularly people of color in this industry, right, in the funeral
Yeah.
industry.
Yeah.
So thank
Um,
you.
I thank you for allowing me to come and having me here. One of the challenges I think in this business is when we lose people that we love, and we have to take care of our own spirit, take care of our own hearts, so that we can be able to nurture and minister to other people. So thank you.